So,
yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone. Kindly keep your video off and your mics on mute. And so we are beginning a series of lectures on women's movement methodological aspects. It will be on, it will not be any chronological history of women's movement in India. Instead, we would try and analyze those struggles from different perspectives. Please remain on mute. Everyone, please remain on mute. So today, what we are going to do is not present a chronological history of women's movement. Instead, we would try and analyze those struggles from different perspectives, throwing light on methodological insights. And we have a very well-known speaker with us who has a unique combination of academics and activism. And she has won laurels on both the fronts. And she has won best of fellowships and has worked in all kinds of difficult circumstances at the grassroots. So WSDC is proud to welcome Professor Indu Agnihotri. Professor Indu Agnihotri taught history in Vivekananda College of Delhi University for over two decades and had completed her higher studies in history in JNU. And many of you may be knowing CWDS. She retired as director of CWDS, which is New Delhi. And that she had joined as a full-time researcher after quitting her teaching job at Delhi University. She has been actively involved with research, teaching, development of women's studies in India and also in women's movement since early 80s. Her research interests span the fields of women's studies, labor and migration, history of women's movement in India, from colonial times to the contemporary, and women's rights, in addition to her training and research in economic history. She has been actively involved with activities of Indian Association of Women's Studies and was its General Secretary from 2011 to 2014. She has numerous research papers to her and many other publications to her name. Today, she would be beginning with the sub-theme, Confronting Colonialism, Women Speak of Rights in Pre-Independence India. I would request all the participants to kindly keep your mic on mute and your video on off. And if you have questions, maybe you can write in the chat box. Given the time constraint, whatever we are able to pick up the good questions, we will be able to pick up and during the discussion hour. Professor Indu Agnihotri would like to present at least for 45 minutes. Am I right, Indu?
Yeah.
Yeah, 45 minutes, maybe a little more. And then we will take up the questions which you have written in the chat box. And right here, I would also like to make an announcement because many of you might leave a little early. The last lecture, which was earlier slated at 9th October, is actually preponed to 6th October. Kindly note it down. The last lecture is on 6th October and not 9th because of technical reasons. We could have not gone up till 9th October. So today, I welcome Professor Indu Agnihotri on behalf of everyone here present. And we begin the first lecture of the series. Welcome, Professor Indu Agnihotri.
Thank you, Manjit. Firstly, let me just check, can you hear clearly? Am I audible?
Yes, I can. That means others also can.
Okay.
Because they are on mute, they will not be able to speak,
okay.
maybe.
Okay, thank you, Manjit, and thank you, Delhi University, for providing me this opportunity. Even though the original idea that we had discussed was different, but we will try to do it in this mode. As Manjit said, these lectures do not aim to provide a long historical narrative. And even if we tried it, the women's movement in India is so vast that it would not be possible to convey and travel that whole ground even in 4 lectures. And I alone would not be able to do it. There have been many participants, there have been many perspectives, though I try to capture other perspectives when I speak. Why do I speak of the colonial period? I think there are two, three reasons why I begin with the colonial period. One is, of course, because I'm a student of history and I do delve into history for an understanding of any of the debates that I confront in my studies and in my practice. But I think it is important to understand the women's movement even in present times, and understanding and knowledge of the colonial period is important. It is important also to understand Indian society today. So, what I'm saying is, both in terms of understanding Indian society and the women's movement in India, it is important to understand, examine the historical period. And here also, it's a very large period. When I speak on the women's movement, I always make a distinction between women's resistance, which has a very, very long history, as long as history of India. But the women's movement, I mean, in terms of organized activity for change and for women's rights, there is a difference between resistance and the women's movement. And when we speak of the movement in this context, I speak about the first half of the 20th century. Although some organizations did come up towards the end of the 19th century, and there was a lot of activity. In the 19th century is one of the richest periods in terms of ideas around women, women's articulation, women's roles, etc. It's embedded in the whole debate around social reform in the 19th century, as well as the whole concept of the Renaissance in the 19th century and in the context of India. But our concern here is with the early 20th century, and I will here talk about why. What I'm saying is that we need to understand that imperialism and the policies that colonial India saw had a direct impact on women's lives. So the articulation and the confrontation in terms of rights emerged from this long experience under colonialism. It is important to understand that, because otherwise, somehow, many of our students also seem to share this misconception that the movement and the women's movement in India arises out of some kind of ideas that are swept ashore from other locations. Those who oppose the movement and seek to undermine it directly attack it in terms of its so-called Western origins, etc. But I think to understand the women's movement, it is absolutely imperative that we understand its embeddedness within the experience of women in India. And it is from there that the aspirations, inspirations, articulation of ideas, of demands, of issues, of modes of organization, modes of expression, all these arise from within this experience. And in this particular case, we are talking about a very long history of colonial rule, which directly impacted women's lives. Along with this statement, I would like to make another statement to also correct another misconception. There is another misconception in the minds of people that imperialism and that the colonial government actually didn't meddle around much with women, because women lived in the private domain and therefore they continued to lead their lives. The British did not want to interfere and intervene too much in that aspect. What I'm seeing is, as a student of history and as a student who has looked at and been involved with the women's movement for over 4 decades, almost 5 decades now, since before the emergency, I would say in 1975. What do we see? That after all, it is women, when there is a colonial government and the mass of women in India were in rural India, they were in agriculture. There was, of course, an emerging middle class. There was an elite section. There were the landlords, landowning classes, as well as the urban business classes. But the mass of women were in agriculture. They were part of the peasantry, and they were part of the urban working classes, which emerged with the early industrialization that colonial India saw. Now, what I'm saying is to think that colonialism allowed these women the luxury to lead their lives uninterfered, unimpacted, unaffected is a total misconception. In fact, be it their social life, be it the context within which this social life was being lived, be it the terms in terms of the daily organization of the peasant's life, his the pressure on the peasantry, the on agriculture at every level, Indian society saw huge changes and a huge oppressive, exploitative system in place during British India. And women were equally impacted by this, and that is why you will find that whenever movements took place of any section of Indian society, women were always there. They were very much there in the peasant masses and in the peasant movements and revolts. They were there in the urban working class movements, strikes, etc. And there is enough evidence. You know, the other part that we hear is that there is no archival material. In fact, I can tell you, I've spent a large part of my life as a student of history delving into archival records. I can tell you, even if I led 5 more such lives, I would still not be able to dig deep enough into the National Archives. I'm not even talking about the state archives or other forms of archives that we today discuss in terms of methodologies in history. So that is the background in which I'm talking about. Secondly, the other aspect that we see is along with the 19th century social reform movement, by the end of the 19th century and early 20th century, we also find a form of visible articulation in the form of magazines, journals, publications, writing by women themselves. So this also leads to, it creates both a literate audience, a readership, and it puts ideas in the public domain which are debated, and there are different sets of ideas. Everyone doesn't agree on everything. So that rich debate is very much there in all the language presses also. It is there to a large extent in English, but in the case of women, we have to understand that the language press, be it in Bangla, be it in Malayalam, be it in Hindi, the North Indian belt, Marathi, Telugu, Tamil, in all the languages you will find there was a vibrant debate going on. Then we come to the forms of uh, articulation, as I say, in more organized way. So, apart from the Arya Mahila Samaj and some of the community-based women's organizations like the Gujarat Stream Mandal, these are community as well as regional or geographically located. There was the Parsi Zoroastrian women's organization. Some of these existed from like 1880s, 90s onwards. But it is in the 20th century that we find attempts are made to organize on a kind of pan-Indian basis, some kind of labeled, organized mode of activity begins. We first see the Bharat Stri Mahamandal, but after initial attempts for the first 4 or 5 years, somehow it does not pick up, even though it does have several chapters. In Sarla Devi Chaudrani, who is the niece of Rabindranath Tagore, is very active in it. She's leading the organization, but it sort of runs aground after a while. And it is from that period onwards that we see fresh attempts. There is also the Prayag Mahila Samiti, which plays a leading role. It brings out a journal called Stri Darpan, etc. And Shobna Nijavan has worked on the record. So has Francesca, Charu, Gupta. All these people have worked on the documents from these organizations. It is around the First World War that we see things beginning to change. We first see a Muslim women's organization, the Anjuman-e Khawateen-e-Muslim, Muslimin is sometimes here, or Islam also, two different names come from 1914. It also has a Dakkan chapter, so it is there based in Aligarh, but it also has a Dakkan chapter. The three organizations that we hear of for the next 50 years, at least in a sense, and which remain in the leadership of the struggle, these are the most common, maybe all of you would have heard. That is the WIA, which is the Women's Indian Association, the National Council for Women in India, which was set up in 1925, and the All India Women's Conference, which comes up in 1927. Now, these three organizations, in a way, and of these, WIA, which is set up in 1917 with its headquarters in the Theosophical Society office, with its leaders having both some very well-known names from political agitations like Annie Besant, Margaret Cousins, Dorothy Gina Rajadasa, there's Amu Swaminathan, there's Sarojini Naidu. All these big names are part of the WIA. We also see another thing, that these women leaders emerge as leaders of political movements also. For instance, be it the Home Rule League or later the mass satyagrahas in the Gandhian movement. And they, even though they hold responsibility in different organizations, but they dialogue and they communicate and they work together. So the WIA emerges as one of the first in this leadership. And I will start with in this lecture, as Manjeet said, we will not be giving a narrative. So there are two documents that I'm focusing on. These two, after this background that I have given, there are two basic documents that I focus on. One is one of the most well-known documents of the Indian women's movement in terms of its pre-independence history, and that is the memorandum which the WIA, and under the leadership of the WIA, women give when they meet with Montagu, who's the Secretary of State for India and the British government, who is on a visit to India as uh, can you hear me? Hello, can you hear me?
Hear me, madam. Okay.
So the WIA drafts a memorandum which they take and they take a deputation to Montagu, who's part of the Montagu-Chelmsford Reforms Committee that you would have all read about in history. In 1919 later, the Act comes. But it is in 1917 when Chelmsford is the viceroy and Montagu is visiting India in connection with these reforms. And these women decide to give a memorandum and they go and meet him as a deputation. And I think that the memorandum, even though it is already very well known, but I think we need to discuss it. Why do we need? And the other document that I will be discussing will be the report of the called the Women's Role in a Planned Economy, a report which the work starts around 1937. The report is readied by 1939, but it gets printed only in 1946 or so, because in the interim period, the entire leadership of the committee with whose report this is, they were almost all either in jail or had to run helter-skelter thanks to the 42 movement and other movements. So this 37, this report of the what I call the, in short, WRPE, Women's Role in a Planned Economy. These are the two documents and the interim period. The first document, and when I focus on these two documents, I do not wish to say that these documents should be read in isolation. In fact, the whole purpose of reading through these documents is to understand the context and the location from which these documents are emerging. We also need to understand then that when we talk about movements, what is it that we are talking about? What does a movement comprise? There are many who still argue that no, pre-independence India did not have a women's movement. And I think we need to see what is a women's movement, how do we read the history of the movement. Before that, we will just briefly go to this document. This document in 1917, it says that we demand that when the franchise is being drawn up, women may be recognized as people, and that it may be worded in such terms as will not disqualify our sex, but allow our women the same opportunities of representation as our men. It further goes on to say that the women of India have awakened to their responsibilities. I'm not reading the whole document, I'm just taking out select sentences. So the women of India have awakened to their responsibilities in the public life and have their own independent opinions about the reforms that are necessary for the progress of India. It goes on to mention organizations and some of their leaders. It speaks of a new outlook of Indian women. It says that women of India understand and support the broad claims of their people for self-government. I'm sorry, there's some disturbance. I don't know where that is coming from, but I will continue. They mention Gandhi and the reform process and the whole struggle for independence. It says that we, as one half of the people, are directly affected by the demand in the United Scheme, and that therefore the government should think of as broad a franchise as possible, and it should be extended directly to the people. And they pray that again that when franchise is being drawn up, women may be recognized as people and be given the same opportunities. It also then, of course, goes on to make very specific demands apart from the right to vote on compulsory and free primary education for boys and girls. You can imagine in 1917, this says, and a widely extended secondary level education, it goes to demand, and says that government should immediately devote all attention to this. Towards the end, it makes a very interesting. We have to understand this is still early days of nationalism also, or the anti-imperialist struggle of this phase. So they do talk about the empire and say we are loyally devoted to the empire. But in the same breath, in the same sentence, we say that we are committed in a sense to public life of the motherland, who that we love so well. And even though they sign as the most obedient servants, I think what we need to understand is that the memorandum, in a sense, signifies a collective beginning to explore new pathways of rights, of asserting rights, of claiming rights, of demanding, and also, in a sense, compelling the state and the governments that be to listen to what the women of India are saying. And even though they represent a very, let us say, elite section to some extent and very educated women, but they speak on behalf of the entire community of women in India. And I think that ability, that commitment that the women's movement showed from its very early beginnings in India to speak on behalf of others, to speak on behalf of the mass of women. We will always pick holes and say, no, they did not speak on this or that or the other. But I think that commitment to want to do so, to claim to do so, was also making a claim vis-a-vis the colonial government in India, which was denying anything in the order of a subject's claims to citizenship. So, in a sense, this memorandum is the first very clear collective articulation of a claim to citizenship, in a sense challenging British imperialism and the premises of the imperialist state. And I think to that extent, this memorandum and the claims that the deputation made are still very, very important. I will immediately go to the next document and then maybe come back when there is time to what happens in between, because what happens in between is equally important. Now, the second document is again coming from one it's a committee. It is a committee which is set up by the Congress. The Congress is in a phase of ministries. All of you may know that between 1937 and 1939, under the 1935 Act, there were provincial governments in which there were Indians who were sitting in government. Different parties or different formations had governments, like Punjab would have the Unionist Party, UP had the Congress. So we are talking about this phase when the Congress realizes that it may be coming to power soon, that there may be some form of independence or self-rule, self-government coming in, and it tries to lay out a vision for the future. It is at this time that I think Subhash Chandra Bose is the president of the Congress, and a national planning committee is set up under the chairmanship of Jawaharlal Nehru, with K.T. Shah as the sort of member secretary of this committee. And the NPC, as we call it, the National Planning Committee, has some 29, I think, 27 or 29 subcommittees. And one of these, which is set up a bit later, but it is called the Subcommittee on Women, whose report is called the Women's Role in a Planned Economy. It is a kind of a vision document. And it is, I think, a very, very relevant document, because in a sense it is coming to terms with the status of women in colonial India and saying, look, this is what we are promised and this is what we are going to look for. It's also important that in a sense KT Shah's introduction to WRP, as I call it, lays out a very specific objective. It says what is the role of planning, that the role of planning is to take justice, equal rights, equality to all citizens, and to bring about change in the lives of the people, including the women. So what has been going on, the colonialism that we have seen, the denial of citizenship, the denial of equality, the denial of justice, and the whole exploitative regime that colonialism has produced and is implementing, that has to be challenged, so that the role of the planned economy will be to sort of undo everything wrong that colonialism has brought about in Indian society, with a commitment to change and a commitment to equality. Now, when we see the dismantling of the Planning Commission in sort of many, many decades later, it may be interesting to see, was that goal being sort of dismantled also, or removed as an objective, that the Planning Commission is done away with? So what does the WRP says? We must remember that the WRP comes in a context, it's a sort of pre-independence phase. There has been a huge depression. Nowadays we are seeing and hearing talk of economic depression, etc. But the world has seen the Great Depression, and the British Empire has sort of experienced and witnessed this Great Depression in different ways, and tried to pass on the costs of the depression and the sort of ravages of the depression to the Indian citizens, because the Indian empire is one of the biggest. We've seen a huge civil disobedience movement on the heels of the Great Depression, and a challenge, but the deepening of the imperial crisis of the structures and of administration, a very consistent confrontation in terms of the demands for rights on the whole issue of the right to vote, which the 1917 memorandum first raised on behalf of women. Even before the Congress or any other political party had done that, the women raised the demand for their vote and a vote for all women. It's a very important point, because the Congress, which articulates the mass opinion of this period, in a sense, does so only in 1931 at the Karachi resolution. But the women have already been campaigning, canvassing, and mobilizing around this for almost 14, 15 years by this time. The WRP comes after the 1935 Government of India Act, which has already put certain systems of provincial governments in place. And there are very active movements by during the from the late 20s to the early 40s. We see some of the most some of the biggest mass movements in in the Indian freedom struggle. So the whole questioning and confrontation of imperialism has become a much wider sort of social movement in this period. The WRP, I'll just quickly go through the chapterization to give you an idea. It talks about economic rights, property rights, education. It has a chapter which is very interestingly called Marriage and Its Problems. Then it has a chapter on family life. Of course, there are miscellaneous issues, etc. What do they actually focus on? As I said, economic rights, education, property rights, marriage, and social. These are the 3, 4 main chapters. And there are differences on that, but it is interesting that they come up with 2, 3 observations which are, in a sense, the maxims of the report, which are they see women as economic beings, as making a contribution to the economy. They talk about women's work in the family and sort of what we are discussing today in terms of the unpaid labor of women. They talk about women's timings, and they say, look, the woman's day is never ending because housework never ends. So they even say there should be some national timings for the kitchen to be wound up so that women get some leisure. There's a whole section on the right to leisure for women. It the committee members did a detailed study, so they were aware of women's rights across both the socialist and the capitalist world. China, USSR, USA, UK, Japan, Latin America, Peru, Chile, Argentina. They were very familiar with whatever was available at that time. And the committee emphasizes, the report emphasizes the linkages between development policies, economic indices, and the social cultural aspect. So they do not sort of dump the socio-cultural prejudices in terms of, oh, these are historical baggage and tradition and we can't do anything about it. They take it on, they confront it headlong. And the debates in there are debates. There's a concept of matrimonial property. They confront the question of what we call illegitimate children. And they say, look, the children have to have rights. It's no fault of theirs that for whatever reason, the relationship between the parents fell apart or whatever the circumstances. But the legality of that relationship should not affect the rights of children. They talk about creches in a very big way in terms of the chapters on women's work, etc. There's a section on nationality. They draw up a children's charter. They look at exclusion and discrimination, because we must remember this is still British times, and women were not allowed to enter certain professions or certain occupations. So these people discuss all that. They talk about social insurance. They discuss reservation, but they are not in favor of reservation. They feel women must have equal entry both in terms of jobs and in terms of the political domain. There is a very detailed discussion on property rights and marriage related laws and the diversity of laws. They on one of these aspects there is a debate and a difference of opinion and a dissent note by Kapila Khanwala on the whole issue of the common civil code or the uniform civil law code as it came to be known. There is both an appreciation of the diversity as well as the desire or the need felt for common rights for all women. They discuss and they are appalled at the whole notion of the restitution of conjugal rights. You will remember that there has been the Rukmabai case before this, and which had shocked the whole country. They have a whole discussion on birth control and limitation of the family. views they express here are very problematic, say if we look at it in today's times, because they discuss very eugenistic, because so in the name of the health of the nation, they want to, in a sense, control the number of children, who has children, what kind of children, so healthy children to be born. The report does not have too much on caste, but it is not as if it is totally missing. It does talk about, for instance, that the statement they make is whatever purpose it may have served in the past, the system as it prevails today has helped in keeping back the progress of the community. It has created inequality amongst the members of the same community by keeping down those who belong to the lower castes for the benefit of those who call themselves as belonging to the upper castes. It also questions caste in terms of the rules governing marriage and practices. It questions caste in terms of the restrictions that upper caste norms place on widows, etc. But more fundamentally, they make a very clear statement that any system for social order which promotes inequality is fundamentally opposed to the spirit of democracy and democratic planning. Insofar, therefore, as the caste system tends to retain inequality or to obstruct women's advance, it must be progressively put an end to. So, what I'm saying is, they have a discussion on unmarried mothers, prostitution, abortion, and they come up with a whole set of recommendations. This report doesn't have too much on women in the peasantry and in agriculture, because the National Planning Committee had a separate committee on rural agrarian questions, etc. So what I'm saying is, and these women, I mean, if I give you the names of some of those who were there, they remained active till, say, when I come into the movement. You will have heard the names of course, uh, you know, the head is Rani Lakshmi Bai Rajwade. There is Sarabhai, Mridula Sarabhai. There's Vijay Lakshmi Pandit. There's Aruna Asaf Ali. There's Vidya Gauri Nilkant. I'm just giving offhand some names, but this is where these women come from. Now, why do I talk about these two reports? And now let me come to what happens in between. You know, to satisfy those queries who believe that actually who may still believe that there was no women's movement in India. Let me tell you that the three major concerns that come out from both the documents, it is about political rights and, of course, education, which they see as linked to the struggle for rights, women's work and contribution to the economy, and lastly, the socio-cultural domain with which is related the whole issue of laws, legal rights, etc. What has gone on in between? By the time this committee gives its report, there has been already a huge amount of effort, both in terms of mass mobilizations, of different segments, and representations to the British government. For instance, massive mobilization on the Child Marriage Restraint Act, both the Sharda Bill and the law that we finally see. And if you see the committee reports and the evidence which came before the Child Marriage Restraint Act, you will be surprised to find that, nowadays when we think of the women's movement, we only think of the big metros, and we think of Delhi, Bombay, Calcutta, Madras, Bangalore, etc. But you would be surprised to see where the representations to the Child Marriage Restraint Act are coming from, and how active women's groups were in some of these, what we would call today the small and medium towns, including in the princely states. Child Marriage Restraint Act is one. Subsequently, we see mobilizations in the general strikes, and workers were a prominent feature, and unions making efforts to register more women as members, despite, you know, all my great friends Radha Kumar and everyone talking about the male dominance in the unions. And I don't challenge that there is no male dominance and there is patriarchy. Nevertheless, the unions in this period made a very, very significant attempt, and a fairly successful attempt. For instance, in 1941, I think, if you read, there's a Bombay worker strike where 2,000 women sit on a hunger strike, a fast in Bombay. 2,000 women, and there is a diary of one of the workers on this strike, which is there. It's about a 40-page diary of a woman worker who's sitting on strike, and on one day, 2,000 women sit on a hunger strike in Bombay. I'm asking you, is that possible so easily today in this day and age? And if the unions were only hotbeds of patriarchal domination, it surely wouldn't happen. That's not the way unions work. If any of you have ever worked or tried to get close to a union, yes, of course, there's patriarchy, but there is much more, much else also apart from patriarchy in the unions. So what we are seeing then is that in 30s, of course, the civil disobedience movement, women were very much there. You read any of the writings on modern India, whether it's Sumit Sarkar's books or any of the others, there's enough evidence to show how much there was. Uh, Towards the end of the 30s, and particularly the 40s, of course, I mean, the whole scene changes with the big peasant upsurges in the form of Tebhaga, the Telangana movement, the Warli movement of the tribals in Thane, big mobilizations of women under the Mahila Atmaraksha Samiti and the Women's Self-Defense League in Punjab, all over. And almost every state has, for instance, Andhra has its Mahila Sabha. Every state has this kind of mobilization. But what I'm saying is, you know, we still, and of course, peasant women were very much part, even when you read about Chori Chora, all the descriptions talk about women in these meetings. Now, you know, this raises a question for many of us. What do we understand by the women's movement? I think this question comes up much more fundamentally today, because today the label we are using and the terminology we are using is that, I mean, we do not, many of my younger colleagues and my own age colleagues do not talk of the women's movement. Everyone prefers to talk of the feminist movement in India. I feel that the women's movement and the mobilizations that women saw throughout the 20th century go far beyond fitting into any feminist frame. You know, nowadays people say, oh, we should ask for a feminist policy. I'm asking you, which government will have a feminist policy, and what would that policy be? After all, governments represent ruling classes. Those ruling classes have an ideology. Those ideologies serve a purpose, and that purpose is to perpetuate the interests and the rules of those ruling classes. Are we trying to say that women across all these different caste classes can have the same ideology? Can any government today that we are looking at, and this we are looking at the capitalist system, we are looking at bourgeois democracies, can any government claim to transcend all this and have one gender sensitive feminist policy? I have my questions. It doesn't mean that we do not confront those governments and those states with our demands or with our issues. Yes, every government should be made accountable towards having a more gender sensitive policy. But to think that one label of feminism, uh, and does this feminism that we espouse, does it confront ruling class ideologies? To my mind, it doesn't. So why is it important to talk about these issues? As one of my closest senior colleagues, I can call her today, although we were both in the movement, she was much, much senior and one of the pioneers of women's studies, in India, Veena Mazumdar, when she was writing about some of these issues, what did she say? She says one of the syndromes manifested by the present phase of globalization is the disappearance or appropriation of earlier diverse voices, perspectives, and concepts by the dominant framework of gender. What is she pointing to? She's pointing to the fact that if we try to sort of foreground only one given framework of gender, I would say feminism, then in a sense it can be erasing, blotting out, undermining various other trends, thoughts, ideologies, ideas which surface in the movement and which need to be discussed, which need to be given space, even if they are to be confronted. We may disagree with some of those ideas, but they need to be discussed in order to be confronted and in order to for that negotiation to happen in the movement at a time when there are attempts being made to appropriate the narrative, appropriate all narratives in a sense, and to appropriate and sort of re-narrativize the history of the women's movement from all kinds of anti-women perspectives. I think it is very important that we are sensitive to these kind of issues. We also need to be sensitive to these issues because the needs today are much greater. You know, there is a general sense when you say that the British left us alone, the British did not touch the private domain. I don't know what is the private domain for women in colonial India. The women who were working on the fields and the farms, in the plantations, in the factories, they faced exploitation and oppression on a daily basis. And I'm not just talking about broad forms of oppression. If anyone thinks that women were spared in any manner the kind of violence that we see today, I'll cite two reports as an instance, only two reports. There is enough in our archives to give you that kind of history on a daily basis, but I'll cite two reports. For instance, in 1932, we get the report of the agrarian distress in the United Provinces, and the committee comprises of Govind Ballabh Pant, Rafi Ahmed Kidwai, and B.N. Tiwari. No woman in the committee. And yet, what do we find? Women come forward and talk about oppression, meaning they said we were stripped naked, we were paraded, we were beaten. Attempts were made to insert objects in our private parts. They give details. They said we were denied the right to draw water from the wells for at least 3 days. And they talk about the punishments. And this is, why I'm raising it. We tend to think, oh, no woman on the committee means these aspects will not come out. No, even then, as far back as 1932, these aspects come about. They lay bare the claims of the British government to the rule of law. They lay bare the claims that Catherine Mayo is making in her book about how British rule is to take India out of barbaric phase because India's history is specific and peculiar. These women and their stories challenge. For instance, if you look at what happens during martial law, there is in Teen Murti, for instance, in the library, if you go, there is what we call the minority report of disturbances in the Punjab. And the minority report is the dissidents report. And the minority report, in the first section itself, you hear that when martial law was imposed in Punjab around the time of Jallianwala and the whole episodes around that in Lahore, martial law is imposed. And these women talk about rape, sexual violence, maybe in a different terminology, and women of different communities, not only one community. So what I'm saying is that if we look at this history, we not only discover our own history, it also it exposes the hollow claims of colonial rulers. It exposes the falseness of the discourse of the imperialists, that this was the white man's burden and they were here because India did not know how to govern itself and they were going to come here to govern us and tell us what to do. In fact, the struggles and the work that we see in, and specifically by the women's organizations, you'll be surprised. I mean, there were, as I said earlier, there were three main areas in which the women's organizations worked. One was the issue of political rights, where there is a continuous engagement. There are debates, and those debates give clues to later debates, and not just later debates, but issues which are still a concern. For instance, the women's organizations start with the understanding that all women should have the right to vote, and we do not look for reservations. Around the late 20s, 30s, the climate is beginning to change. Begum Shahnawaz Khan actually accepts and tries to push the demand for reservations for minorities. Now, we may disagree because we disagree with the basis for religion based reservations. But I think we should understand what is the issue that was being raised was that in independent India, will minorities have a place? Will minorities have their right to represent? Will their voice be heard? Will there be space for diversity in independent India? I think that is a question that still exists. The whole question of reservation in jobs for women, that has been a debate right through in the women's movement also. The other aspect, but one thing that they continue to give the signal to the imperial government is, we will negotiate, but we will not compromise on the right to representation. That is unnegotiable in a sense, inalienable right they are demanding. So that is one stream of thought. The other stream of thought is around the issue of women's work. And I think there are very deep insights in the report of the WRP. The third is the most problematic, and it remains a problem till today. And that is the socio-cultural domain, where marriage, family law, personal law, all these issues come in. Widows' rights, and there are debates about should widows be allowed to remarry, despite the struggles in the 19th century and Ishwar Chand Vidyasagar's campaign and the whole law in 1861, 1856, etc. But what we find is that there are still reservations and there is a resistance from the upper castes about it. It is there that Ambedkar and later Periyar also, they are making their interventions, and I think those interventions are having an impact in different regions. In the north, we have the Arya Samaj. There are the different social reform movements which continue through the 20th century, but ultimately it is the women's organizations which become the voice of the people. And in the whole issue on socio-cultural rights, both the concerns come up. The concern to have equal rights for all women, as well as the concern to preserve the diversity and to open up new avenues for women of all sections. Uh, I think I'm going to stop here because you told me 45 minutes. I have much more to say, but Manjeet, I will stop here so that you can have time for questions and answers. Okay?
Yeah, in fact, if you can, maybe you can take maybe 5 more minutes if you want to, because I haven't got many questions as yet, unless people put now, because I have got only just 1 or 2 questions till now. I was wondering if people have questions. I even requested in case they want to write, then they can write right away. Somebody had written as to what were the activities which are banned and which women could not do in colonial times. So this is the only kind of question which I've got as yet.
Oh, well, it was not so much as banned. You see, two, three things. One is there is a social taboo against women doing certain things, women going out, etc. That's the broad social framework and environment. But The second point you have to remember is that women's literacy was very low. So women had no entry into occupations where I mean, a certain amount of literacy was required, a certain amount of educational qualification was required. The only sort of welcoming occupational groups are teachers, for that too, like elementary, primary school teachers, etc. Women's entry into the working class was not banned at all. In fact, women, I think they were proportionately, in terms of proportionate to the working class altogether. There were, say, in the mines, for instance, 1/3 of the people working in underground work profile of the mines was women and children. They were nearly 40% in the mines, in the coal mines and Raniganj, Jharia, all this. And there are huge, there's an AIWC report on that. There's a government report, of course. There's a Congress report also on the women in the mines. There's then they were graduating from being ANMs, midwives, etc., to nurses. And then, but the nursing profession is actually getting a push, not so much because they want more nurses, more women in nursing, but because of the Second World War, primarily. I mean, some bit happens in the First World War, but when the Second World War is coming up, the colonial government is very keen on training nurses. So you'd be surprised to know, I mean, even in schools, not just nursing schools separately. And if you live in Delhi, for instance, you would have seen the Lady Reading School near Bara Hindu Rao. This is one of, because Lady Reading was one of the viceroys of that period who took a specific interest in nursing training. But from my own experience, I can tell you that people like my mother, who went to school during that period around the Second World War, they were given nursing training in schools. My mother had diplomas run by the for courses run by the St. John's Ambulance and the Salvation Army and all these people, and these trainings were conducted in schools. So they also had their own interests. The British colonial government had its own interest when it was pushing nursing. But for instance, the medical profession was, doctors were recruited as part of the army. And in that, to begin with, women were not allowed to enter. And when they did, then it was British or Anglo-Indian women more. There's for instance, you can see figures about how many doctors and what's their background. So it is only towards the end of the 30s really that more doctors as Indians start coming. Otherwise, it's primarily the British and then the Anglo-Indians. Of course, Lady Dufferin is, and the Lady Dufferin Fund is known to have pushed some of this education. For instance, in railways, etc., they would be, they would be employed in the cleaning professions, in the more low-level menial professions, but not in the judiciary, not in the. I mean, those are still issues for us, but at that time there were certain bars, and the WRP has a whole section talking about that and demanding that these disqualifications should be removed. Not only that, the All India Women's Conference and the National Council of Women in India come up by the late 30s, 40s. They have what is called the Indian Women's Charter in 1946, I think the AIWC has. They also have a memorandum on sex-linked disqualifications. So they list out the disqualifications, which are both in terms of the law and in terms of opportunities. And I think this becomes a very big point in terms of propagating. And like all such documents, the documents serve multiple purposes. You go to the government as a deputation and make a demand, but you also use your memorandum to mobilize, to build public opinion, to set goals, to negotiate. For instance, when you're saying in 1917 you're putting forward a demand for the right to vote, it is preceding the Congress having accepted women's right to vote. So you're, in a sense, you're negotiating within the movement. You're negotiating with other women who may be saying that no, I mean, we're not qualified to do this. We don't have the confidence. You're also negotiating that space in the public domain. You get that?
And
So,
can we take more questions?
yes, yes.
Yeah. There are two more questions. One is, one person is asking as to any other organization activities on the Northeast, if in that period of 19th century, if you could kindly elaborate. And the other one is that I would like to ask important contribution of mobilization. Thank you. Mobilization of organized women was the expansion of the ideological repertoire of the Indian national through the discourse of liberal Indian feminism in the context you are talked about. So basically, they're saying that they're also feminist contribution. And you read an excerpt from the archives that raised the issue of different forms of violence against women back then, and even today we witness such horrendous and violent acts against women of all ages and stages of life. Why do you think we are all still there, and how can we as a society rise above them? So these are some observation and some questions of young people.
So these are mixed. I'm not sure. On the Northeast, the mobilizations are different. The organization, of course, the most well-known in the Northeast is Rani Gadialu's revolt and of the women of Manipur. That is the most well-known for the pre-independence period. I would tend to say that the archives in Guwahati and some of the other places where that material would be available would have much more. But it is also likely that the northeastern revolts would have seen women rising as part of the tribals and the tribes who are revolting against the British government or whoever else may have been the local ruler. And that raises a question for all of us. But Rani Gadialu's is the most well documented. She was imprisoned and then she had to be released. I think Nehru's government released her. It's known as the Nupiland and second Nupiland, all that. That is documented. I also have the documents from that. There are also certain other mobilizations which you hear of in terms of the labor inquiry in 1906, I think, and then again in the 20s in 24. The Assam Labor Inquiry report talks about some of the issues over there. The plantation labor revolts are very much there. Even Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay in her book talks about it, but I talked about the inquiry committees that AIWC and some of these people put up. They also talk about it. They had a whole inquiry on the plantations, in fact, in this period, and WRP has also a whole thing. And plantations, as you would know, since women's presence in the plantations is a very big presence, the pluckers are primarily women. So the women's struggles for plantation workers are very clearly there. This question of violence, and the other point about liberal feminism. Look, what I would say is, as far as violence is concerned, I personally believe that violence is a manifestation of the inequality that women are subjected to. But that inequality is not always and not only on account of gender. The inequality for a woman in India may come as for a Dalit landless woman. It is on account of her being Dalit and landless and then a woman. So the specific manifestation of violence against a woman takes on on the form of sexual violence. But it is not as if that violence is being perpetrated on her only on account of her being a woman. And I would say that for any number of locations and contexts in which sexual violence against women is perpetrated, be it tribal women, be it women in the Northeast, the roots of the conflict lie in other things. The roots of conflict lie in terms of the political domain. But when women protest or when women are to be punished, then the form of punishment, the form of reprisal, the form of asserting power, the form of asserting class, caste, or political power in any conflict or in a conflict zone, that is specifically gendered in the case of women. But it is those categories of women who are more vulnerable to that. All women are vulnerable to sexual violence, but specific categories of women or women in special locations of deprivation and powerlessness are more vulnerable to those situations where this kind of perpetration of violence happens. So the fight against violence has to keep these structural roots in mind. It has to keep in mind the embeddedness of this violence in other structures of inequality. So it is not just patriarchy. It is that power is manifest through a patriarchal assertion and atrocity, and that is inflicted on the woman's body. But that power does not come from patriarchy alone always. That is my belief. And it is a continuum in women's life in terms of what kind of violence they witness, the specific. I mean, from the 70s, when we were coming into the movement, I remember we talked about the rural scenario where it was landlords' armies, caste-based armies, which, and women would often be alone, especially today also, if you look at it. When the migrants come out, if there are only men who are going out and the women are left behind, then there is a vulnerability of the woman-headed household in effect over there, or the woman who's left behind. In some cases, when I have done interviews with migrant families, they have told me that we go sequentially. All the men don't go away at the same time. Some men stay behind. But the fact that the man may stay behind doesn't mean that violence can be totally rooted out, because violence comes from power, and the power comes also from the backing of the machinery. So that uh, wider linkage is something the women's movement has always kept in mind when we have talked about the caste class linkages of inflicting atrocities, and it has been the experience of the movement. In terms of the whole issue of liberal feminism, uh, I believe that while colonial India definitely saw a phase of liberal feminism, or what you would call the manifestations of expression of women's protest in the mode of what liberal feminists do. But I don't think it was that alone. The peasant revolts and women's active involvement in peasant revolts and movements definitely was not under any liberal feminist framework. Yes, the educated upper middle class and landowning women from the princely states, uh, to the extent that they were imbibing certain values, they often went traveled abroad, had experiences, be it the princely class women or other educated Indian middle class women, very elite, of course, as I said, wives of ICS officers, etc. But they played a definite role, elite women, in a scenario where the mass of Indian women are denied education. These elite women played a big role. Yes, they may have been, their perspectives may have been sort of circumscribed by their class location, but I think many made a conscious attempt to transcend their location in terms of their privileges and look at the condition of women beyond their own caste, class, family, and individual location. And I think it is not just them as individuals. I think we have to understand that the phase of anti imperialism, the struggles of anti imperialism, not only anti imperialism, but feudalism, because women's oppression was linked. After all, there is an alliance between the imperialists and the feudal classes in this period. So when agrarian revolts are happening, it is equally the feudal class which is being challenged as much as the colonial government, which exacts high rates of revenue. But it is the feudal class, because the peasant, as we always say, he pays rent. The tenant farmer pays rent to the landlord, and the landlord pays the revenue. The tenant farmer doesn't directly pay revenue to the British government in throughout India. That is the case in colonial times. Now, that conflict which the tenant farmer or the peasant family has vis-a-vis the landlord, that is rooted in feudal exploitation and oppression. And we all know how feudal oppression is equally linked to the issue of patriarchal assertion of power vis-a-vis women. So that linkage is very much there, and that is why women come out very openly in the peasant movements. There's hardly any peasant movement that you see in Indian history in colonial times where women are not present, because for them it is their everyday life and experience. And I think the Telangana and Tebhaga studies make it very, very clear, as also Godavari's own book on the Worli struggle. And of course now we have much more historical research on it. So that is, I mean, it is intertwined, it is inherent that conflict and contradiction are inherent. Unfortunately, what we are finding today is that even that perception that women and women's movement and women's organizations had in colonial India, it seems to have gone missing. Because when when you define your struggle within a feminist narrative or a gender narrative, you in a sense do away with the class linkage, do away with the because in a sense you are saying that this is a woman's perspective. What When we speak of the women's movement in terms of its wider caste class linkages, we keep in mind those divisions in society, and we make specific efforts to draw in women from certain sections and classes. Unfortunately, to my mind, the feminist movement that we see today, and I don't want to run down the feminist movement at all, but what is happening is that because of this huge urban middle class that we have, this urban middle class is so taken up by the experience of its own denials, of its own exclusions, of its own discriminations, that attempt and that effort that should be made to build wider linkages with other cross sections of society, that is not always there. I'm saying that very consciously, because even in terms of what we see as Dalit feminism, sometimes we find that the Dalit women's question is also being defined from a very, very much more urban location. But the roots of the conflict and the violence which Dalit women face regularly, it's an ongoing process, lie in that system of land ownership, power, and denial and discrimination, which is rooted in our land relations. Unfortunately, those struggles, except in certain tribal belts or in certain areas of peasant movements, those are not happening. So, in the women's movement, our consciousness and our alertness to those wider roots and linkages sometimes get muted, also because there are just so many of us. We're just so many, the middle class women are today the big bulky presence in the women's movement. And sometimes I think we need to stop and look beyond ourselves. It's absolutely imperative. If our movement has to make an impact socially, it has to go beyond articulating. I'm not saying articulation of middle class women's demands is wrong, But for the women's movement to get to gather greater strength, it has to once again attempt to build those linkages. Some of the mass organizations have those linkages, but in the projection of the women's movement, and particularly in the projection of the feminist movement, what is happening is it is being sort of it is overlapping with a kind of middle class articulation of women's very very legitimate demands, and I don't disagree with those demands.
Indu, can we have two more questions?
Yeah.
Yeah. One is, of course, that one is asking as to who are more responsible for women's subordination in India, is it colonial regime or indigenous patriarchal system? And the other one is a little longish, but in the lecture, you made an observation in the difference between the women movement and feminist movement in India, and how the younger generation tend to call it feminist movement. Could you please elaborate the difference between the two? Because many countries in Europe and even in Canada came up with the feminist policies. So are you saying they are missing the whole point of the women's movement altogether? In fact, you have been elaborating on this already, but then let's see.
Um, Look, who's more responsible? You can't say. We don't want to give free license to our indigenous patriarchs, whoever they may be. Okay, so they are of course guilty of whatever patriarchy they practice. But the point that I would make, as both a student of history and somebody who's looked at the women's movement, I think imperialism and the whole system of imperialism and the policies that they implemented, in a sense, constituted the social frame within uh, that patriarchy was also perpetuated. So there's no question of who's the bigger or who's more responsible. I think colonialism definitely was confronted and it had to go, and it went, thankfully. We would be wrong in thinking that it was only colonialism which was perpetuating exploitation and oppression on women, because, as I said, firstly they had their feudal allies, and the feudal allies were very very visible in even in the 40s in India. So life in India, after all, it wasn't always the viceroy and his men who were coming into your fields. It was the landlords men who were coming, all the mukaddams and everything that we'd hear of, or in the plantations, the Naikins. Some of them were women also, let me tell you, who were perpetuating some of these systems of oppression in the plantations. It is well known. There were women sardars. There are even today women sardars, meaning, in the recruitment and the contractors. Even today in migration, when we study, there are women who are also part of the trafficking process. So, while the gender divides are there, but there are many sections of people who cross the gender divide in terms of perpetuating oppression and exploitation, because oppression and exploitation and patriarchy are systemic. They are not only individual linked, that this man is patriarchal and he inflicts his patriarchal authority on me as an individual. After all, these are systems of oppression and exploitation, and they have their roots in the wider social structures. And I think that has been the biggest gain in the women's movement, that historically we have sort of tracked and uncovered these structures of oppression. So colonialism and feudalism are both part of that system within which patriarchal structures are embedded, as is the modern Indian state. The modern Indian state is equally a patriarchal structure. And if we think that we can fight patriarchy individually without confronting the state, and when I say state, I mean the state structures. I don't mean a particular government. It is states. It's inherent in the policies, where funds go, how policies are determined and decided. And that is why for at least 40 years, the women's movement that some of us have been a part of has engaged with those policies, be it the plan process, be it other policies that governments come up with, and successive governments. So these debates have to go on, and they are not centered around individuals. Of course, it is true that in the life of a woman, that patriarchy is enacted, inflicted, and implemented through individuals who may be men and also some women. But we would be wrong in believing that our fight against these individuals in our life will put an end to patriarchy. I think our lives will end, but that patriarchy is not going to end by just our. But it's part of our life, so we fight, because after all, we struggle for our own individual rights as much as we struggle for women's rights in a more abstract capacity and in a more abstract formulation. But the that's the conflict that we undergo as individuals. But we are all individuals who are social beings, and our lives are being constructed and framed by the policies that our society, our governments, the institutions within which we function, they draw. And there is an inherent patriarchy in most of these structures, which needs to be confronted at every step, at every level also. Uh, as far as feminism go, this is a long debate. It's not going to end in this session, because I have my own views and experience, and you have your own views, experience, understanding, and your aspirations. I have no uh, I have no issue with feminism. It's not as if I disagree with feminism per se. I disagree with projecting feminism and the feminist movement as the be all and end all of the women's movement. That I'm very clear about in my own understanding, because I believe, and it is, for instance, this is a long debate. Maitri Chaudhary's written about it, Mary's written about it, I've written about it in my piece on Neera Ben in the Indian Journal of Gender Studies. For instance, someone like Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay, she never called herself a feminist. Now, here is a woman who defied every norm of patriarchy in colonial times, in a sense. But she doesn't see herself. Sarojini Naidu was very clear, and she made a public speech saying, look, our movement is not that type of feminist movement, etc. What is the debate as far as I'm concerned? For me, it is not about feminism being having a Western origin or anything. In my mind and from my thinking, feminism to me is a bourgeois ideology. It remains a bourgeois ideology, no matter how expanded a version of feminism you may try to define. And I think Uma Chakravarti, Geeta, many of them have tried to conceptually develop both the concepts of patriarchy and of feminism, and there are many others. But I mean, I'm sorry, there are about 100 feminisms floating around. If I read Padma's book, Padma Anagol, then there's imperial feminism, then there's something called white feminism, apart from the liberal, socialist, radical feminisms that are being taught in all women's studies courses. Then there may be black feminism, then there may be Dalit feminism today in India. There are any number of feminisms. What I'm saying is the word feminist doesn't convey anything to me except saying that it concerns a woman, or it is concerned with women. That's all. But you can have, I have myself encountered people who have talked to me about indigenous feminism. Now, I don't know what this indigenous feminism will be. Will this indigenous feminism defend and uphold indigenous capitalism tomorrow? Will it confront neoliberal capitalism? Will it confront the neoliberal capitalism led globalization policies? What I'm saying is that, to me, this word, because the only way feminism is sought to be defined, even within the movement that I am part of in India, is with a suffix or a prefix. Without that prefix, it doesn't mean anything, by and large, except for saying it is womanist and it is about women. Now, I'm sorry, but every woman who writes is not a feminist. Or is she? I'm asking you, is she? Every woman who paints, is she a feminist artist? So what is feminism then? That is my worry, and that is my query. And that is why, to me, the larger ambit of the women's movement in India, it allows for different ideological formulations, which was the history in colonial times. There were the leftists, there were the communists, there were the socialists. Kamala Devi is part of the Congress Socialist Party. She's in the AIWC, and in the AIWC, all these people work together. Pulrenu Guha heads the committee which goes and inquires into the Raniganj, Jharia coal fields, etc. She's working under the All India Women's Conference. So All India Women's Conference allows for the Sultan Jahans and the Begums and the princely people. There is a larger umbrella there. Within that class, caste, everything is operating. Within that, feudalism is operating. Within that, the Tatars, I mean, all the women from all these big families, or the white or the brown sahibs, as we call them, they're all there in these organizations, but they all play a part. It is important to understand and appreciate the part they play, and yet be critically evaluating the roles they play. And I think that is the way social science proceeds, that we appreciate. You know, to say that they were not feminists is not to say that they were not revolutionaries. I think they were far more revolutionary than many of us in our day and age. Because they were challenging norms which were much more difficult in a society and in a phase of history which was much more difficult. It's more easy for me to sit here and say it when, you know, I've done a PhD, when thousands and thousands of others have studied and reached levels even beyond mine. But for these women, widows, Durga Bai, I mean, these are child widows, some of them. They come out of difficult marriages in a time when even Mahatma Gandhi can write, I mean, he can actually write a letter saying Kamala Devi is a divorcee. So, or whatever. So, how can we make her the president of the organization? That's the kind of prejudice that is prevailing in this day and age. I think these women were far ahead to be able to say that, look, what you have a notion of illegitimate, but this child has rights. I think they were far ahead of their age. They had their debates. Many disagreed and said, no, how can you say you're upholding illegitimacy? If you discuss rights of prostitutes, then you're sort of uh, encouraging immoral this thing. If you ask for rights of widows, then you are encouraging immoral acts in society. This is the world that these women were up against, but they fought, they stood up, they applied their minds in a very rational manner, and they chose to put these in policy documents. And I think that has lasting value, that you
Indu, I
go.
have to interrupt. There are
Yeah.
3 more questions.
Okay. Yeah.
So we'll have little time now. So
Yeah.
I will not be able to take any more questions now.
Yeah.
So I know that women took part in women's movement through their work. One is asking as to if women took part in the women's movement through their work in art and poetry, and how far this was fruitful. The second is, how do you see the feminist movement where postmodernism has destabilized the notion of universal femininity and take critical approach to previous feminist discourses? Can we take another one? I will just read out. How would you like to relate the Mother India controversy with the women's movement or modern term feminism? Would you say that there's another question. Would you say that the trans women's movement were not a part of Indian women's movement from the very beginning?
Which movements were not part of?
The trans, see, we say
Trans.
the trans women's movement were not part of the Indian women's movement from the very beginning.
I'm sorry, I haven't got it. Class or trans?
Say, would you say that trans women's movement were not the part of Indian women's movement from the very beginning? It's a movement.
Okay, now some of these are linked, so I'll just take them together.
Sure.
Look, I think what we have seen over the last 40 years, especially through women's studies, but even through other disciplinary contributions and developments in other disciplines also, we have seen I mean, a total efflorescence of what we call women's art, poetry, reading, writing, etc. And I think it has given, it has both enriched the disciplines as well as enriched our appreciation of art and poetry or any kind of expression, literary expression. Some of it definitely has a visible, potent feminist expression, but not all of it. All of it does not. And even if we were to look for that feminist expression, I would still say that just as we would critically reflect on any writer's expression in terms of its class or caste biases or its linkages and its roots. I mean, for instance, there's this whole debate about Tolstoy, whether the peasant in the Tolstoy is a music or what's it? What's the? I'm forgetting the word even. Oh, it's so long ago that these debates happened in my life. But the word we use for the peasant, how can I forget? But anyway, in terms of the class roots of the envisioning of the agent and agency of change, those questions would still arise. Okay. So they may be very powerful gendered expressions and may be very beautiful also. So we must appreciate those. That does not mean that we put away other critical lenses. So just because a woman is speaking, are we going to stop being critical in terms of our other trainings, be it our literature training or my social science history training or my movement training? Are we going to put aside all that just because there's a gender lens and a gender frame? What I'm saying is, even within the gender lens, even within the gender frame, even within the feminist gaze, there is uh, there is something to do with caste, class, maybe race, maybe religion, maybe ethnicity, maybe nationality. Should we stop thinking about those critical perspectives? I'm saying no. Even a feminist gaze has to be deconstructed in terms of its social roots and social origins, as well as its social envisioning. There is no universal feminist gaze. I do not accept there is a universal woman or feminine category, but whether that femininity does not have its origins in other social locations, that I would not accept. A woman is not supra-class, a woman is not supra-caste, a woman is not supra-nationality, as we have discovered in our own country in very, very concrete ways. That in the eyes of the state, in the eyes of the people, in the eyes of society, you are what you are. You may be a peasant, you may be a worker, you may be a domestic worker, you may be a manual scavenger, you may be a Hindu, you may be a Muslim, you may be a tribal, as the Northeast girls faced the kind of hostility in a city like Delhi. What I'm saying is, you are what you are. You carry the victim, possible victimhood of that identity, as well as the potential power of that identity. Both you carry. You are vulnerable to the victimhood. You have the power of the potential that your identity gives you. And I think identity has come up in a very big way over the last 20-30 years as a very emotive category, as a potent category of both change as well as stifling change, as well as stifling diversity. And I think we need to think critically about that. So that is where I will stop on that aspect. As far as this Mother India and feminism, I'm not sure whether I understand. Are we saying Mother India in terms of Mayo? Well, Mayo was an out and out spokesperson of imperialism. Out and out. There's no doubt about it. And I think Gandhi did well to dismiss her. But it wasn't just Gandhi alone. If you read the writing in the 30s, almost every journal that was coming out, every periodical that was coming out in India carried pieces against, for or against, but many, many more against Catherine Mayo. Agnes Smedley wrote against her, of all the people. I mean, she says, what is this woman saying? And she's a spokesperson for justifying white rule in India. Smedley is very clear on it, you know. I mean, there's no hiding the fact. So what I'm saying is what role Mayo was playing, but and what there was no two ways about confronting what Mayo was saying, but I think in any case there was a larger churning on in Indian society thanks more directly to the colonial encounter. As a student of history, I would say that churning would have happened, but maybe in different ways had this long experience of colonial rule not been there. But this more than 200 years of British domination in our country, it triggered certain forms of expression and assertion of power, as well as an exposure to other kinds of societies in a more sustained way. You know, even earlier, India from ancient times had exchange of ideas, culture, trade, from ancient times, from prehistoric, I mean, proto-historic times, definitely we can say from proto-historic times. But the kind of sustained exposure and interaction which colonial rule enforced on India on unequal terms, but it gave us a different kind of exposure. And look, let us understand the pace of change in industrial societies is much faster, much higher than pre-industrial societies. So, what Indians are exposed to once industrialization happens in England and capitalism advances in the US, that pace of change also forces the pace of change in terms of your own critical reflection about your own social practices, prejudices, social forms of organization. And I think that was what the colonial encounter was about. It also triggered a trend which we see till today, that you don't want to give up everything that is part of your own history and culture. So, this tenacity of tradition. But the tenacity of tradition, as we all see, is selective. So, selective and very anti women practices are held on to as tradition, whereas pro women practices are being given up. After all, there were pro women and more tolerant or diverse practices in our traditions, be it amongst religious groups or amongst regions or communities of any order. But what we are finding is that anti women practices of all communities have been appropriated by others. So, dowry is appropriated by others. Nobody appropriates meher, for instance. I mean, if there was something good, why didn't we take that? But it is the upper caste practices, the anti-women traditions, which are being selectively projected as our history, our tradition, our culture. And I think that is normal because these traditions and these selective practices serve a purpose to uphold what is seen as the social order by the ruling elites. They may be caste based elites, they may be class based elites. So they see those. So patriarchy is part of the ruling class vision, it is part of the ruling class ideology. It is not alien to that ideology or their needs. And they will give it up the day it doesn't suit us. The day it doesn't suit us, they will give it up. I'm telling you, and they do give up. Why do they selectively carry on with certain traditions and practices in the name of heritage, culture? It is because they serve a purpose. They serve a purpose to sort of enforce a social order which does not allow for violation of caste norms. It does not allow for challenging those rules which the ruling elites lay down. You know, after all, those norms and rules are laid down by the powerful, and they serve their purpose. So I think that is where the women's movement and the ideology of the women's movement play a role. There is a commonality of gender even when there is a difference in terms of other aspects of social class, origins, etc. But there is a commonality of gender, which in fact forms a basis for what we call in common parlance the feminist movement and the feminist perspective. It is the commonality of the experience of gender-based discrimination, oppression. However, what I'm trying to say is that beyond the commonality of gender, there are other forms and other social roots of oppression and exploitation and discrimination. When we critique patriarchy and we build a feminist movement which confronts patriarchy, it may not necessarily confront all these other aspects of social hierarchies. Even though, as I said, attempts have been made over the last several decades to redefine feminism to include all these. But I'm saying feminism's equation with power and ruling ideologies may want us to think more critical. Yeah. Manjeet, are you there? Hello?
Yeah, I'm
Hello?
there. Yeah, I'm there. Well,
Yeah.
I don't think we can take up any more questions. The time is up. Where is your picture gone?
I'm there.
Your picture's not there.
Oh, on
Yeah,
my
now, yeah,
screen it's
yes,
there.
yeah. So we have in fact covered a long range of questions, and also the richness of your lecture had been really great, because you have brought in so many documents which many of people may have not even consulted. So the richness of the lecture, I think most of the people who are the women's studies students or even historians, it would be of great help to them. And the kind of questions which have really mazed through the feminism, feudalism, colonialism, and so many, and violence. So they are very interesting, and I think it will also keep coming up in our next lectures. So these are very important questions which came up, and I really thank you on behalf of all the participants that it was really a very good lecture. And many of have in fact actually already put in the chat that they really enjoyed the lecture. Thank you so much. And we will be meeting on 25th again. And yeah, please.
Well, I didn't look at the chat, so I don't know if that record is available either. If you can forward it to me, because I didn't have time while I was speaking to look at that chat, frankly. But what I would say is, I'm really happy to get feedback, So if you have questions, I would request Manjeet to share my email ID with all of you. I'd be most happy to get questions, including disagreements, because frankly, they make me think more. They make me think more critically about my own views and points. So you're welcome. Yeah.
Yeah. So the next lecture, as we had said, that it will be on 25th. Once again, I want to really give the information that the last lecture would be on 6th and not 9th, because some of you may have joined later. And kindly keep this in your notebooks that the last lecture will be on 6th and not 9th. So see you on 25th. Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you so much, Professor Indu Agnihotri.
Thank you.
Thank you.